In the blood-drenched courts of ancient tyrants, betrayal wasn't just punished, it was performed. Not in a courtroom, not with a noose, but in front of a laughing, jeering crowd as loyal dogs tore flesh from bone. These weren't ordinary executions. They were feasts of vengeance. In certain royal courts, from ancient Asia to medieval Europe, kings and emperors didn't simply kill their enemies. They fed them, alive, to specially trained packs of hounds. The victims? Dissidents, rivals, advisors who dared speak too freely. These executions weren't carried out in secret dungeons. No, they were spectacles, theater, sometimes even sport. Imagine the king himself, reclined on silk cushions, sipping wine, while his favorite hunting dogs gnaw at the intestines of a still screaming man who once sat at his council table. And it didn't just happen once. This practice, known as damnatio ad bestias in the Roman world, took even darker, more personal forms across history, where monarchs bred animals to kill humans, laughed as they begged for mercy, and turned executions into banquets of horror. And at the center of it all, power, ego, madness. It began with a betrayal, a whisper in the halls of power, and it ended with blood-soaked earth and the howling of dogs. In 3rd century China, the Wu kingdom stood divided by war, greed, and paranoia. Amid the chaos, a young noble named Sun Hao rose to power, crowned emperor in an age when emperors disappeared as quickly as they emerged. But Sun Hao was no ordinary ruler. At first, he was welcomed, a stabilizing figure after years of instability. Yet behind his polished image, a rot festered. Sun Hao's reign would descend into one of the most horrific and baffling periods of cruelty in Chinese imperial history. He became known by one name, the Dog Emperor, not because he loved dogs, but because he fed people to them. Sun Hao's court transformed from a seat of governance into a sadistic circus. Ministers feared to speak their minds. Advisors vanished overnight. Rumors of disloyalty, even if unproven, could be fatal. The punishment? Death by dogs. But not in a dungeon. Not in secret. Sun Hao built an arena within palace grounds, where executions were conducted in full view of the imperial court. His prized hounds, massive mastiff-like beasts bred for war, were starved and trained to attack on command. He gave the spectacle a name: Feast of the Faithless. Noblemen, poets, teachers, even servants who displeased him were dragged before the pack, often bound in silk robes, a perverse nod to their former status. The emperor would recline on a raised platform, surrounded by concubines and generals, while musicians played to the sound of screaming. One historian described the events as ceremonies of punishment, where Sun Hao would sip wine and toss scraps of food, not to the condemned, but to the dogs themselves as they fed. This wasn't justice. It was control through terror. The victims rarely committed treason. Some merely criticized taxation. Others failed to bow low enough. A few were accused of casting bad omens, a convenient way for the emperor to purge anyone who might threaten his image. What made Sun Hao truly terrifying wasn't just his cruelty. It was his laughter. Chroniclers noted he often laughed during the executions, joking that dogs are better judges than men. Some executions took hours. He would have prisoners' limbs broken first, so they couldn't run, then unleash the dogs, who were trained not to kill quickly, but to play. They'd tear off fingers, bite through tendons, disembowel slowly. And if a victim passed out, he'd be revived with salt water, only for the dogs to resume. Eventually, these gruesome acts became so infamous that even Sun Hao's own generals and family began to fear looking him in the eye. The palace grew silent. Formalities became rigid. Everyone knew a single word could lead to the pit. The court chronicler Gua Mo once described him as a man who had the power of gods, but the hunger of beasts. When famine struck and rebellions rose, Sun Hao turned increasingly paranoid. He began feeding entire families to his dogs, wives, children, even infants, accusing them of inherited treason. The arena was no longer enough. Rumors claimed he had chambers underground where dogs prowled freely, their barks echoing through the palace walls at night. By the time the Jin dynasty overthrew Sun Hao in 280 AD, the new rulers found his imperial palace littered with bones, blood-stained tiles, and cages of starving dogs. They destroyed the arena, buried the records, But the horror lived on in whispers. And centuries later, another empire would turn animal execution into a spectacle of its own. Before gladiators, before emperors ruled from marble palaces, there was blood and beasts and the roars of thousands, calling not for mercy, but for more carnage. Damnatio ad bestias, Latin for condemnation to beasts. It was not a punishment. It was a warning. Rome, at its height, was not merely an empire of architecture and aqueducts. It was a machine built on dominance, of land, of mind, and of spectacle. The Colosseum wasn't a stadium. It was a theater of fear where the state demonstrated its godlike power through unimaginable cruelty. In this world, lions and leopards were more than exotic animals. They were instruments of the law. And for Rome's enemies, traitors, rebels, Christians, runaway slaves, there was no gallows. There were fangs. The condemned were paraded through the streets, mocked, beaten, and then brought into the arena. Naked, sometimes drugged, always terrified. They were not executed by soldiers. No, that would be too swift. Instead, gates would rise, and from the shadows emerged the bestii, starved, provoked, and often half-mad from captivity. Lions imported from North Africa, bears from Gaul, hyenas, panthers, even crocodiles in some accounts. The people cheered. Rome didn't hide its brutality. It celebrated it. Emperors sat high above, veiled in silk, watching death as if it were theater, because it was. For some, it was entertainment. For others, an expression of imperial dominance. But what few understand is that these weren't random displays of bloodlust. The Romans ritualized them. They chose beasts for symbolic reasons. Lions for their nobility, used against senators or generals who betrayed Rome. Wolves, symbols of Romulus and Remus, unleashed on those accused of attacking the empire itself. Dogs, large Molossan hounds, used on common thieves and deserters, a lesser death for a lesser man. One of the most horrific accounts comes from Emperor Domitian, who staged a spectacle where a dozen political dissenters were tied to wooden poles. Each pole was doused in blood and meat scraps. Then the cages opened. Wild dogs charged forth and tore into them with such force that guards had to intervene not to save the men, but to drag the dogs away for the next execution. The Colosseum itself had trapdoors beneath the sand, engineered so that wild animals could appear suddenly, ambushing prisoners who thought they were alone. Sometimes, condemned men were even forced to fight the animals, given dull weapons as a cruel illusion of hope. Even more disturbing, Rome exported the practice. From Britannia to the far reaches of Asia Minor, Roman governors recreated the damnatio ad bestias as local propaganda. They showed subject peoples the price of disobedience, not through laws, but through teeth. And then came the Christians. Early followers of Christ were seen not just as heretics, but threats to Roman order. Their refusal to worship the emperor placed them among the worst offenders. Thousands were fed to beasts under emperors like Nero and Trajan, their deaths used to quell uprisings and amuse the mob in equal measure. One account tells of a young Christian girl in 107 AD who was tied to a post, smeared in honey, and left overnight in a pit of jackals. The next morning, only bone fragments remained. But there was a twist. Rome's love of spectacle eventually backfired. The Christians who died in the arena became martyrs. The people, once entertained, began to whisper. Why do these people die without fear? They asked. Some grew uncomfortable. Some converted. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity, the practice of damnatio ad bestias began to fade. But it didn't disappear entirely. For centuries after, underground arenas, rogue provinces, and shadow courts kept the tradition alive in quiet corners of the empire. Rome may have fallen, but its horrors endured. And in the East, in the palace of the Ottomans, another kind of animal justice was taking root, far from the public eye, but just as merciless. Behind the towering gates of Topkapi Palace, beneath the jeweled robes and golden turbans, there was a secret. A dark, snarling secret buried beneath marble courtyards and perfumed gardens. The world knew the Ottoman sultans as conquerors, builders of empires, keepers of faith. But inside the labyrinthine heart of the palace, power was not preserved with mercy. It was protected with blood and teeth. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had stretched across 3 continents. From the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, the sultans ruled millions. But the greater the empire, the deeper the fear. And nowhere was this fear more potent than in the sultan's inner circle. Courtiers, viziers, concubines, even royal sons, anyone could be a threat. And the punishments had to be swift, quiet, and unforgettable. This is where the execution hounds came in. The Ottomans had long used animals in warfare, were elephants, camels, falcons. But during the reign of Sultan Selim the Grim, a new tactic emerged: trained mastiffs, kept in a special section of the palace known only as the lower kennels. These were no ordinary dogs. They were massive, scarred beasts, some weighing over 150 pounds, bred not for war, but for terror. They were fed raw meat from childhood, denied human touch, conditioned with screams. The purpose? To eliminate threats without a trace. When a vizier displeased the sultan, or a concubine was suspected of poisoning another, they weren't always beheaded. Sometimes they were led, blindfolded, through the palace gardens, told they were being summoned for audience. But they never arrived. Instead, they were taken below, through ancient stone tunnels beneath the palace kitchens. There, in dim candlelight, the dogs awaited. Muzzled, pacing, foaming. A whisper from a eunuch. A nod from the handler. The muzzle removed. And then, nothing but screams. These dogs were trained to kill quietly. Not like lions or tigers. No roaring, no thrashing. Just fast, brutal precision, ripping out throats, tearing open bellies. Within minutes, the body would be gone. What remained was burned in the palace furnace, known to insiders as the mouth of fire. There were no public records, no burial, no justice. The victim had simply fallen ill or left on pilgrimage. But those who worked near the kitchens knew. They heard the barks. They smelled the blood. Selim wasn't alone. His son, Suleiman the Magnificent, who history praises for his legal reforms, allegedly continued the practice, more discreetly, more rarely, but with no less cruelty. His paranoia was sharper than steel. In a palace where brothers strangled each other with silken cords, death by dog was just another instrument of control. Some of the dogs were even gifted to regional governors, a token of loyalty, they called it. But the implication was clear: disobedience will be eaten. Centuries later, travelers to Topkapi Palace still whispered about the ghost dogs, howling in the night. Palace guards would not speak of them. Some claimed their bones were buried in the old cisterns. Others believed the lineage still existed, hidden in private kennels, owned by descendants of the palace guard. What's even more disturbing? The use of dogs as silent executioners was never officially recorded. It existed in the margins: oral history, servant gossip, foreign envoys who heard things but never dared write them plainly. Which means, we may never know how many died with dog teeth in their flesh and imperial secrets buried in their throats. But the Ottomans weren't the only Eastern power to weaponize animals for justice. In the jungles of southern India, another ruler would take the idea further, much further. He didn't just feed humans to dogs. He made them fight tigers. In the sweltering heat of southern India, where monsoon rains soak the earth and jungle vines wrap around ancient stone, there once ruled a man whose name inspired both reverence and terror: Tipu Sultan, known to history as the Tiger of Mysore. To the British, he was a fierce enemy. To his people, a complicated symbol of resistance. But buried deep beneath his military brilliance and political maneuvering was a darker legacy, one that few dare to speak of. Because Tipu didn't just fight like a tiger. He punished like one. According to scattered records, court rumors, and terrified British spies, Tipu Sultan ran a private fortress in Srirangapatna, where traitors, spies, and dissenters weren't executed by blade. They were given to beasts. At first, it seemed symbolic. Tipu famously kept a live tiger chained in a gilded pen near his court, claiming it as a sign of his divine right. Visitors were told the tiger represented righteous judgment. Some even claimed it would growl when a liar spoke. But it didn't stop at tigers. Tipu maintained a secret collection of hunting dogs, giant, sand-colored hounds trained in the jungles. These weren't palace pets. These were trained killers, hardened by war. His generals used them to chase down escaped prisoners and dissenters fleeing through the forests. Yet that was only the beginning. When rebellions flared within his kingdom, especially among certain Hindu landlords and suspected British informants, Tipu devised a punishment so theatrical, so grotesque, that it felt ripped from a nightmare. The condemned would be bound, taken to an arena on the outskirts of the fortress, and then pitted against a tiger. Not just any tiger, his personal tiger. British intelligence reports, once dismissed as exaggerations, describe scenes where bound prisoners were dumped into a pit, bleeding, terrified, and the tiger was let in, freshly starved, its roar shaking the earth. The dogs were sometimes released afterward to clean what remained. One such account, dated 1791, tells of a rebel leader who refused to pay taxes. He and his 2 sons were taken at night. Locals heard screams echoing from the jungle. Days later, villagers discovered tiger prints, a blood-stained turban, and nothing else. But what makes Tipu's story truly haunting is his obsession with control through fear. He commissioned mechanical art that reflected his philosophy. In one infamous piece, now preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, a wooden sculpture depicts a European soldier being mauled by a tiger. Pull a lever, and the soldier screams while the tiger growls. It wasn't just art. It was a message. To the British, you are meat. To his people, defy me, and the jungle will eat you. Some historians argue these tales were wartime propaganda, but others point to eyewitnesses, Indian and British, who described nightly dog howls near the prison walls, who saw cages wheeled and under canvas, who heard the growls of something too large to be a dog. Tipu was eventually killed by British forces in 1799 during the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. When they stormed his fortress, they found weapons, jewels, and war plans. They also found blood-stained pits and empty iron cages. One British officer wrote in his journal, "I do not know whether it was a zoo or a tomb. Perhaps both." With Tipu's fall, the records of his animal punishments faded. But the legend endured, whispered in villages, passed down like a curse. A ruler who judged with claws and fangs. A man who blurred the line between king and beast. And while his empire collapsed, in the West, across European courts, royals were quietly borrowing the same tactics. Only this time, there were no arenas, no pits, just hunting dogs and hungry secrets. Europe prides itself on elegance, velvet cloaks, candlelit courts, civilized rule. But beneath the perfume and powdered wigs, there were dogs. Silent, loyal, bloodthirsty. From the sprawling palaces of Versailles to the icy halls of Prussia, European monarchs kept hunting hounds not only as companions, but as enforcers. Not for sport, for punishment. It was a quiet tradition, never spoken aloud in law books or royal decrees. Yet amongst servants, chambermaids, and low-ranking soldiers, the stories spread like wildfire. One of the earliest accounts comes from France, under the reign of Louis XI, known as the Universal Spider. A master manipulator and ruthless king, Louis was famous for his paranoia. He trusted no one, not even his guards. Instead, he trusted his greyhounds. But these were no ordinary dogs. They were said to have tasted human blood, a scent that binds, one courtier whispered. When a nobleman plotted against him, Louis didn't send soldiers. He sent a handler with 2 leash dogs and a locked room. The next morning, the room was empty. Only a bloody collar and a shattered goblet remained. Louis is rumored to have kept a chambre de chiens, a dog chamber, beneath his private wing, where he housed hounds trained in attack patterns. No one was allowed inside, not even the queen. Centuries later, similar rumors surfaced in Prussia under Frederick William I, the Soldier King. Known for his brutal discipline, Frederick kept a private unit of dogs, giant mastiffs, that accompanied his military drills. Disobedient soldiers were sometimes ordered into the woods with no weapons, followed minutes later by the hounds. The official record? Deserter missing in action, but fellow soldiers whispered of screams in the dark, of dogs returning with blood on their jowls, of a king who watched from a distance, cigar in hand, timing how long it took for the barking to stop. Even more chilling was the case of Peter the Great of Russia, a reformer to the outside world, but behind palace walls, a man of unpredictable rages. After discovering a plot among his own guards in the early 1700s, Peter reportedly had several men stripped and tied to posts in the royal kennels. Over 3 days, the dogs were unleashed in shifts, some to maim, some to kill, some merely to watch. One man was kept alive for 2 days, his wounds bandaged between sessions. Peter called it education through agony. And then there was the aristocracy. In remote manors and shadowy baronies, lesser nobles began copying the habits of kings. They trained their estate hounds not just for foxes, but for trespassers, poachers, and defilers. And when famine spread, and serfs began stealing bread, punishment came not with rope, but with snarling jaws. An English manor near Cornwall was discovered in 1811 with 6 human skeletons buried in the dog yard. The baron claimed they were intruders who resisted arrest. The town magistrate did not question it, because who would believe the poor over the word of a nobleman? Perhaps the most disturbing part? These deaths were never public. There were no trials, no announcements, just disappearances. The dogs? They saw it all, heard the screams, smelled the fear. They became silent witnesses to Europe's darkest punishments, never confessing, never judged. In some cases, monarchs would even have their dogs taxidermied after death, placed in royal halls, hung with medals, trophies, of loyalty or complicity. By the 19th century, public executions became rarer, and Europe embraced the illusion of civility. But behind closed doors, the practice lingered. It evolved. Private prisons, torture chambers, intelligence agencies, and in modern regimes, the beast found a new leash. It wasn't just about dogs anymore. It was about what they represented: unquestioning obedience, fear without reason. And when regimes fell, the ghosts of these punishments lingered in the gulags, in the camps, in the hidden corners of the world where humanity is only skin deep. Because the most dangerous monsters were not the animals. They were the men who smiled as they watched. History tells us we've evolved, that the days of monarchs feeding traitors to beasts are behind us. But history also lies, because the hunger for domination, the urge to punish not just to kill, but to terrorize, never vanished. It simply changed clothes. When royal thrones crumbled in the 20th century, new tyrants rose, wrapped not in ermine robes, but in military uniforms and political slogans. And while their tools became more modern, their instincts remained primitive. In Stalin's Soviet Union, stories emerged from the gulags of Siberia, tales of prisoners thrown into kennels with trained dogs for interrogation. Officially, these were dismissed as rumors. Unofficially, survivors described dogs trained to bite, not kill, inflicting pain, fear, submission. One former prisoner, a writer named Varlam Shalamov, wrote of metal doors behind which barking echoed endlessly. You knew, once you went in, you didn't scream. You whimpered. In Nazi Germany, SS officers at concentration camps used German shepherds as lethal instruments. The dogs were trained to target specific weak points: the neck, the groin, the face. They weren't only for killing. They were for breaking people. In Buchenwald, guards would sometimes order the dogs to attack prisoners who failed to salute fast enough. The dogs weren't punished. They were praised, rewarded. In some cases, they were even given names that mocked the inmates: Stalin, Moses, Jude. And it wasn't just totalitarian regimes. In 1960s America, civil rights protesters were mauled by police dogs in the streets of Birmingham. The footage is burned into history: young black men and women thrown to the ground, screaming, while canines tore into their flesh. Those weren't rogue animals. They were following orders. In Latin American dictatorships, from Pinochet's Chile to Argentina's dirty war, dissidents disappeared into dark cells where dogs were used not just for intimidation, but for recreational torment. Soldiers laughing, victims bleeding, and always the beast, obedient, brutal, and silent. So what is it about using dogs? Lions were wild, tigers unpredictable, but dogs, man's best friend, became the perfect symbol of twisted control. They obey without question. They bond. They protect. But when turned into weapons, they destroy with terrifying efficiency. To use a dog to kill a man is to dehumanize both. The victim is reduced to prey, the dog to a tool. And the master? He becomes untouchable. There's a chilling psychological symmetry to it. The ruler commands. The dog obeys. The traitor dies. No weapons. No blood on royal hands. Just teeth. And even today, in modern prisons, riot suppression, and state violence, we see echoes. Snarling animals used not as defense, but as a message. We own the leash, and we decide when to let go, because the beast never left. It simply waits, muzzled, patient, until power, once again, decides it needs fear more than justice. Power has always worn a mask. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it roars. But behind every empire, every throne, and every blood-soaked regime, there is a darker truth. Those who rule by fear don't just kill. They perform. Whether it was Sun Hao sipping wine as dogs tore his ministers apart, or Roman crowds cheering while lions devoured rebels, or European monarchs quietly silencing dissent with trained hounds in candlelit chambers, the goal was never just execution. It was obliteration. Of resistance. Of identity. Of the soul. To feed a man to a beast is to send a message. You are less than an animal. You are forgotten before you die. And yet, these stories are not forgotten. They live on in whispers, in scars, in shadows cast by the towering statues of kings and conquerors. Because history doesn't just remember greatness. It remembers cruelty. And the question it leaves us with is chilling. If given absolute power, what kind of beast might live inside us? If this story gripped you, if the silence of history's darkest corners made your skin crawl, make sure to subscribe, drop a comment, and share your thoughts below. Want more twisted truths and forbidden history? Check out our next episode, The Forgotten Cannibal Colonies of the Pacific, where survival turns settlers into monsters. And remember, it's not always the monsters who growl. Sometimes they laugh.